Hi, everybody. Welcome to Screen Less, Play More, the podcast. I am Cynthia, the founder of ScreenLessPlayMore.com, and I am so excited to dive in with my guest, Ty Tashiro. He has a PhD in psychology, and he is the author of The Science of Happily Ever After, What Really Matters in the Quest for Enduring Love. And he is also the author of Awkward, The Science of Why We're Socially Awkward and Why That's Awesome. And I am very excited to ask you some questions about this tech world we're living in and how it relates to our relationships and our dating and our marriage, and also awkwardness and how that's being affected by things like social media and technology. So welcome, Ty Tashiro.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yay, I'm so glad to talk to you. I'm going to kind of go back and forth between The Science of Happily Ever After and Awkward a little bit. But first, I did have questions about your book about being awkward, because as I started reading it, I thought, oh, okay, this is just talking about autism. And it's really not. You talked about a study by Simon Baron Cohen, who's actually the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen,
That's right.
the
That's
comedian.
a fun fact.
And he says, like, there's actually like this bell curve of like autistic traits. And when you test the general population, people that don't have autism are actually not 0 on this scale. They're at 16. And the autism cutoff is 32. So a lot of us don't have autism, but we can still be very awkward. And what do you feel like those traits are that we're talking about that aren't autistic, but they're still really awkward?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe a little bit of a meta comment just to start out.
Okay.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting to me right now about psychiatry and psychology is whether or not mental diagnoses, depression, anxiety, autism, whether those are categorical, so either or binary things, or if they're follow a bell curve and are normally distributed in the general population. And so there's now been hundreds of studies done exploring this across all kinds of different diagnoses. And again, when they do meta-analyses and look at all the studies in aggregate, what they find is that very few diagnoses are categorical.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a really helpful way for folks to think about psychological struggles and psychological challenges in general. Because the way it's currently communicated, you either have something or you don't. And that's just not accurate based on the data. So there's, with awkward, one of the things I thought about was, so if autistic traits are normally distributed in the general population, what happens if you fall outside the top 1 percentile, which is where the cutoff would be for an autism diagnosis? What happens if you're at the 97th, 98th percentile? Even the 85th percentile in the general population, you would still have a lot of social difficulties. So to your original question, there's 3 characteristics of social awkwardness. So it's social skill deficits. That means you have a hard time knowing what to do in social situations. I think awkward or not, we've all been there at certain times. Sometimes you know what to do and you just don't execute very well. And that can happen as well. There's communication problems. And that goes 2 ways. So it can be that you have a hard time communicating what you mean to other people. Or sometimes awkward people, for example, are overly abrupt or curt about things. Don't cushion don't cushion the honesty sometimes. Which,
or some people would say no filter.
That's right. It can be rough. But also they have a hard time discerning the underlying meaning that people are trying to communicate to them. And when you sit there and you start to break it down, it just makes you wonder how we ever understand what anyone's trying to say to us. There's obviously the verbal content that people are saying, but there's also nonverbal cues. There's the context of the social situation. There's the history that you have with that person. All these things combine, tone of voice, all these things combine to convey an underlying meaning, and awkward people have a hard time with that. The third thing is kind of my favorite of the 3. It's obsessive interests. And I like to say that awkward people really love what they love. And
Yeah.
I think that's a great quality, but sometimes they love things so much it's to their social detriment. And so sometimes they can be really esoterically interested in, let's say, stereotypically, maybe like Dungeons and Dragons or Star Trek or something like that. I had a friend who was really into Game of Thrones.
Okay.
And while a lot of people like that show, she learned Dothraki, which is one of the
Oh my
dialects.
gosh.
Yeah, they
She
speak.
learned how to speak it,
Yes, which is amazing, right? That's an unbelievable level of
especially
obsessive
because
interest.
it's a made up language.
Exactly. But she went down all these Reddit rabbit holes and, um, and that's fine. And like, I think that's great theoretically. But if you start talking about that a lot in a social, social situation with people who don't love Game of Thrones that much, that can be a tough social circumstance. So
Right.
it's those three things. It's social skill deficits, communication problems, and obsessive interests. And, those are the same kind of three major categories for autism. But we don't want to confuse saying, like you said at the start, that autism is the same thing as being socially awkward. They're two distinct kinds of things. It's just that the people who are socially awkward don't have as many symptoms or their symptoms are less intense. It doesn't cause the same level of life impairment that it would for someone who has an autism diagnosis.
Which I'm glad you mentioned that about just all diagnoses, because I've really found that in the last few years of just people I know with different diagnoses that it really truly is a spectrum. And I like that as a whatever the word is, like a metaphor of like being along this sort of number line of like it can be more severe, it can be less severe. And as you're saying, we've all got some of these traits. We've all got maybe a little bit of ADHD, a little bit of OCD, a little bit of autism, a little, we all just are all over the place on the spectrum, and some are more than less. But like when you're saying that somebody has a very obsessive interest in something, the way that that becomes awkward is that maybe is that just all they ever want to talk about in social situations?
Yeah, so it could become that way. So let's say someone loves Dungeons and Dragons, let's say.
Uh,
So the obsessive interest could become so deep that it almost looks addictive, to use that
okay.
term loosely, where now they're foregoing other good things in their life to focus on this Dungeons
Okay.
and Dragons obsessive interest, which is not good, obviously. It can come out in communication. One of the things awkward people can struggle with is lecturing folks on on topics that maybe other folks wouldn't be as interested in.
Okay.
So, I'm not a lover of Dungeons and Dragons myself. So
Okay.
someone could tell me, hey, I really love Dungeons and Dragons. We could talk about it for 5 or 10 minutes. I'd probably reached my limit of how
Right.
much
So you're
Dungeons
saying
and
like if
Dragons
they're
I
going to
could take.
lecture you and they're going on and on for 20 minutes, you're like,
Yeah,
okay, enough now. And perhaps they're not reading the social cues of this person is starting to look bored. I better change the subject.
exactly. So they're over talking. It can also happen professionally. So let's say someone is really passionate about mathematics and once again, it can be interesting for a while,
Right.
but you need to have it concise and then kind of move on to other topics that other people would be interested about.
Hmm.
So I love the obsessive interest that awkward people have because I just love the degree of passion and persistence that they have for whatever their interest is. But it's also something when they're growing up, they need to learn how to contextualize that and, how to have a back and forth so that the
Right.
other person is engaged in the conversation.
One thing I'm really interested in is how this is all being affected by texting, social media, um, gaming, just all these things of like, in some ways, I feel like it might be easier these days to be awkward. And some ways, I think it could be way harder. So, yeah, maybe if you're feeling awkward, it's a lot easier to text somebody than to have an in person conversation. Maybe stakes feel lower. But as you were saying before, it really cuts out social cues, facial expressions, tone of voice, stuff like that. And I'm also wondering, you said in the book, a lot of times when you're awkward, you really have to practice and maybe imitate your friends to learn how to be less awkward. And are kids now getting enough face-to-face practice to learn how to be less socially awkward? It's like maybe you don't even have to ask somebody out. Oh, I'll do Tinder, or I'll text her or whatever. You don't have to break up with anybody in person. Oh, I'll just text them. So it's like, what is going on? How is this affecting us?
Yeah, no, it's not great, as you could imagine, for some of the reasons that you laid out. Um, yeah, I mean, if you just sit there and you think to yourself, how would I describe a 5 minute social interaction to an alien who has never seen human interaction before? Which is a little bit what I had to do when I was writing the book, because I had to think about what are the points of failure, basically in a social interaction. And there are dozens of cues and social skills required every minute of a social interaction. It's actually unbelievably complex, right? To navigate. Sometimes I'll just break it down for folks like, think about all the things that need to be in order from your shoulders up in the first 30 seconds of a conversation for you not to be awkward. And it'll just make you socially anxious thinking about all the things. Your hair cannot be sticking up in a weird way. You can't have spinach in your teeth. You can't have a booger hanging out. There's all these things that could go wrong that would be super awkward, or that you could say something, I mean, heaven forbid. So there's all these things that can go wrong. It's unbelievably complex. You need to practice this, and you need to practice it in person. That's the only way you're gonna learn it. So yeah, if you're spending a disproportionate amount of time on your screen and you're not getting that live practice, that's going to be a problem. And you see that sometimes. I mean, this isn't all the time, obviously, but sometimes you walk by a group of teenagers who are hanging out in a group and they're all texting each other.
Yes.
And that makes me want to scream.
Oh, it drives me absolutely insane.
Yeah. When I see that, I mean, I obviously don't say anything, but one of my favorite things here in New York is there's this article about a high school student who started a Luddite club. And so, these are all teens who think technology is gone too far. And so it's encouraged to have a flip phone to be part of this Luddite club. They do weird things like meet in person for 2 hours a week and sit in nature and talk to each other, or read books together.
What we used to just call hanging out.
That's right. That's right. And they have to figure it out, right? So no one's giving them prompts to talk about things. They have to figure out, how do I structure the social interaction? I bet sometimes it's uncomfortable and there's awkward pauses, or they're not sure how to navigate a tough topic, but that's all important learning. And those are the most gratifying interactions, right? As gratifying as something is online, being in person for that same kind of thing is just always way better. And so that should be the standard. So I think technology's fine, just like anything else, if it's in moderation. The problem is if you look at some of these Pew polls and other data that have come out about how much people are on their phones and on their technology every day, they're on it way too long, right, for it to be any good for their social life.
Yeah.
Yeah. One last thing I might add, Cynthia, to that is for people who are socially awkward, there's a little bit of a caveat here. So when things started going online, like back in the MySpace day and the blogging day and Tumblr days, that was actually pretty great for socially awkward people. Because if you had some of these esoteric interests or obsessive interests, and you're in the middle of nowhere, all of a sudden you can find people who shared those interests and find a community. So I want to be careful to say, once again, I don't think technology is horrible. Technology is evil by nature. It can certainly lead to a lot of good things. What I tell young people when I speak to them is just, hey, treat that though as a means to an end. And the end that you're shooting for is being face to face with people and enjoying those interactions as much as you can.
That's what I was going to ask is if you then, because I agree with you, it's like if you can find that group of people online that has that interest, that's great. But then would you say, see if you possibly can find those people that are online, but that they're in your town, and do some sort of a meetup?
Yes.
Like use that as a way to find your people in your area?
Exactly, exactly. So, one of my favorite studies among many now that have come out, but one of my favorite studies about technology in teens, they said, well, what's the difference between teens who have satisfying social lives and seem to be thriving socially versus teens who are lonely and struggling? And then they looked at how do they use social media and where their differences. And I think it just lined up perfectly, I think, with the kind of wisdom that's really useful for folks. So they found that teens who had great social lives, they liked more of their friends' posts. They commented positively on their friends' successes more often. And so they were building social capital in that way. They also found that they use social media as a means to get face to face with people.
Okay.
Whereas the teens who were struggling socially did not use it in those same ways. So they, these teens who were doing well socially, they had this wisdom to say, hey, this is a means to an end. Let's use this to support folks, to be pro-social. And then ultimately, let's use this as a way to get together.
Because I think a lot of people at first were saying, no, it's really social. I'm constantly talking to my friends. I'm texting all the time. I'm going online. And I think that might have been true at first. But I think now, as they've changed algorithms, I was talking to Erin Lochner, who wrote The Opt Out Family, and she was talking about how Instagram used to be basically just a photo album of your friends' photos, and it was chronological, and they changed the algorithm to start serving you up stuff that they thought you would like. So you started looking at photos of people you had never met ever and would never meet that lived in completely other parts of the nation or the world. And so it's kind of changed that maybe when you're on your phone, you're really not talking to anybody that you know or you're ever going to speak to. So there's been a little bit of a shift from like, yeah, maybe that was great at first that all these kids were texting each other, and now it's not really what they're doing necessarily on their phones. I wonder what percentage of time they are texting versus what percentage of time are they watching TikTok.
That's right. And you're exactly right about that. The shift has been actually pretty dramatic. I was just at a conference last week and I was chatting with this guy who was a developer at Twitter. And, he was much more knowledgeable about this than me. And in his opinion, he said when they went to ads, that's when the whole thing changed.
Mm.
And I think some of us who are a little bit older, our teenagers, can remember the old Facebook days when it
Hmm.
was shiny and new, and it actually was really cool. And you reconnected with people, and most of the people you were friends with or followed,
Right.
or you saw on your timeline, were people you had real relationships with. And now it's more parasocial in nature, and of course more commercialized. I mean, I understand those tech companies had to find a way to make some money, but I think the way that was done with the ad strategy versus the subscription strategy,
Mhm.
has turned those platforms into very different things. So yeah, social media is mostly parasocial now because even people you do know, some of the studies that have come out about posting say the average person just really doesn't post much anymore. So you're not even seeing content from the people that you care about a whole lot.
And also, what I've found interesting is I have some people that I have known forever and I love them so much. They are super good friends and their posts are so annoying. And I think to myself, if I didn't know you and I read this post, I would be like, you're so full of yourself. Like all these humble brags and stuff. And I'm like, but no, when I see this person for coffee, they're amazing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's like they're a different person online. There's so much like you have to brand yourself almost. And like that's what makes me so sad about these teenagers being online and having to have sort of a brand and a facade. And it's not the real you. And it's quite possibly a person you may be putting out a persona that isn't you and that nobody would like, and they would
Yes.
really like you in person if you would only post more of who you really are.
Right, right. Yeah, no, no, totally. I mean, the user interface might encourage some not optimal behavior, let's call it. And
Yeah.
then, of course, all the platforms have their different cultures.
Yeah.
So, like a friend on Twitter, that's a pretty combative platform. So you're seeing that side of them, that's maybe a small part of their personality, but they're just adapting to the platform. On Instagram, someone might appear overly perfect or something like that, and like, that's not really who they are. So yeah, it is confusing in that way. And one of the things I wonder though is, I mean, I spent a fair amount of time at universities, and so with young people, and one of the things I guess that anecdotally I'm seeing is they're opting for more private profiles. They're actually, I think they're better. For example, I'm Gen X. I think they're actually better than like my generation now at having some awareness about, hey, this isn't great.
Mhm.
This is not good. So can I think about some strategies so that it's not as problematic as it's been for folks, let's say the past 10 or 15 years.
Yeah,
So
like the tide may be turning where people are just realizing that this is going nowhere fast.
yeah, no, it's not it's not the way to go. I think they just realize how disappointing. I think that's the realization a lot of them come to towards the end of high
Yeah,
school or early in college is like, this is a land of disappointment in a
yeah.
lot of ways. And so let's just once again use this in moderation, maybe for really important events. Let's go ahead and put that out there. And I think that's a much more mature that's a much more mature way to look at it. And now
Mhm.
they have the benefit of hindsight coming into this after seeing millennials and a little bit of Gen X make some mistakes with
Mhm.
how they use the platforms.
So I also am ancient and did not get a computer in my home until I was a sophomore in high school. I actually wrote papers freshman year of high school on a typewriter.
Wow.
And um, so I I really briefly dabbled in Match.com, and I was probably almost 30. And I'm really interested in your insights about online dating. Um, you read The Science of Happily Ever After, and well, dating in general, I think, is so different now. And like I said, I got kind of into that just barely before I got married, but um, it's just different. You can text people, you can, find people online. And again, with this sort of awkwardness, and I'm just wondering, you know, if you text someone or if you find somebody online, you're cutting out just so many of these interesting intricacies about relationships, like how does somebody smell? How does somebody's voice sound? How does somebody's laugh sound? Just all these things that you cannot learn over a computer screen. And um, I was reading a study that it said that they found that online marriages are finding that they are having less satisfying and less stable marriages if somebody met their partner online instead of meeting them in person. And yeah, just kind of wondering what you think about that, and like how does this all play in with successful relationships? And you know you wrote an entire book about the science of happily
Yeah.
ever after.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. Well, let's do the big picture, I guess. So let's say, what is it people are shooting for in the long run?
right.
And still, despite all the changes in dating, people still want lifelong partnership. So about 90% of people say they want to get married or have a lifelong partnership someday. So it's still a popular form of, having a romantic companion, despite all the changes. And people in that long-term relationship want to be happy and they want it for it to be stable, until death do you part kind of thing. So happy and stable, those are the two things we're going for in the long run. Dating is this in-between medium to find the person that'll give us the happy and stable relationship. And that medium has changed dramatically just over the past 2 decades. So maybe we can start there with,
Mhm.
some of the changes. So in 1960, 1970, 1980, if you look at the percentage of people who were not married under the age of 40, it was about 6 or 7% in
Wow.
each of those decades. That number started going up in the 1990s, and in 2020, it was 25% of people
Wow.
under the age of 40 are not married. So that's a dramatic increase from the
You
6 or
said that was in
7%.
2020?
2020, yeah.
One
So
out
you
of
could,
four people is not married.
that's right. That's right. And at no point in recent history have there been more single people at any point in time. So the combination of later age of marriage and divorce then combined to have it that about 51% of people are married or, in a long-term partnership where they're living together, cohabitating. But the other 49% of people are single over the age of 18. So that's the highest rate of singlehood that also we've ever seen. So just taking that by itself, you're going to date for longer than previous generations did. And the chances of you being single at some point in your life are much higher than they used to be. And the last kind of contextual thing I'll share about dating, just to show how different it is. There's a recent Pew poll that I really liked. They asked some really interesting questions. And one of the questions they asked was, what are you looking for right now in a romantic relationship? I think that's a good question. So about
Hmm.
10% of people said that they're looking for something casual. And so these are
Okay.
folks age 18 to 29, right? So
Okay.
10% looking for something casual, 14% are looking for something committed, and then 26% said it could be either or. So something committed or casual. So let's be optimistic about that and say 40% of people are could be looking for something committed.
Okay.
Now, the most striking thing to folks who aren't in the 18 to 29-year-old age range
Hmm.
is that 50% of people said they're not looking to date at all,
Okay.
which is unprecedented in pretty much the history of dating
Hmm.
in the United States. So, half of all young people don't even want to date. And
Hmm.
among those people who don't want to date, 62% of them are women. So it's a higher rate for women not wanting to date. That's really high, and
Yeah.
if you think back to those earlier generations like boomers or Gen X, they were looking to marry. Really, if you're a boomer, by the time you got out of college,
Yeah.
you would have been married on average.
Hmm.
And for Gen X, they married a little bit later, but still in their early 20s. And so this is a real dramatic difference. And it's a crazy thing because dating is harder now in a lot of ways, and it
Hmm.
lasts for a lot longer. So it's kind
Right.
of the worst combination of two possibilities.
Right. Well, you made a great example in your book. It was like if you're having a dinner party and you have to figure out when to put the duck in the oven, it's like if you know, like, well, I want to work on my career. I don't think I want to get married till I'm at least 30. Then you've got like quite a few years where yeah, you maybe want to date, but you're not really looking for something serious. So you're kind of almost in the back of your head pushing off meeting somebody great. You're like really not looking for the end all be all person. So, like, what does that look like, too? To spend an entire decade just being casual because you're like, well, why find the person now if I don't really want to get married for 10 more years? And
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And one just nuance there is maybe unlike Gen X, for example, or elder millennials, as we call them, uh, not even casual stuff. So that 50% not even interested in casual. So they're just like not wanting to date
and
at all.
did the study have any insight into why they feel that way?
So there's a few hypotheses. So that provides some, and then there's other kind of academic research that can shed some light on that. So just one other thing from that polling data, also from Pew, when they asked them, "Hey, how's your love life going right now?" So 75% said not well, and only 25% said it's going going pretty well. So it's pretty bad out there. And I don't say this to rip on young adults at all. I think it's for a
Mhm.
point of empathy to say, hey, it's difficult to date, and people are having a hard time finding their way. So your question of why is that the case? There's a few hypotheses. So the one I like the least is the political arguments that are thrown out there, probably on Twitter or wherever. So liberals might say, it's the manosphere podcasts that are, ruining everything. The conservatives might say, it's the feminists who are
Okay.
causing all these problems. I think that's kind of lazy thinking. There's some other more substantive explanations, I think. So one, which you alluded to earlier, is that they want to do other things. So young millennials and Gen Z, they have things they want to get accomplished before they get married, unlike
Mhm.
other generations. So they want to have financial security and they want to have their career in place before they get married. And
Mhm.
they want that much more than earlier generations did. Of course, they've come into an era of economic instability and job instability. So that kind of
Mhm.
thwarts that desire is one of the reasons why they're marrying later or having difficulties with the dating. Related to that, there's now what they call the crisis of marriageable men. So,
Yes, I wanted to get into that.
yeah, if you're a heterosexual woman, there's this paucity of what they would call marriageable men. And the easiest way to look at that is just through socioeconomic factors. So, probably one of my favorite studies here was one that compared the pool of unmarried men to the pool of married men. So if you look at married men and look at their income, for example, and their educational attainment, how does that compare to men who are unmarried? Because those are the men available to
Mhm.
date, right? And by thought experiment, but statistically, what they found across millions of people from the census data was that the unmarried group would need to be 30% more educated to be, quote unquote, marriageable. They would
Wow.
need to earn 58% more income to
Then
match
the
what the married group had. Yeah.
wow.
So just by socioeconomic status, compared to people who are married, these men who are not married are lagging behind in a lot of ways.
Because standards have raised, or why?
I think it's always been an imperative for heterosexual women. If you look back even decades,
Right.
socioeconomic status has been a big deal. But young men now are going to college less often. They're completing high school less often than girls and women are, and so that immediately sets them on a different trajectory, right? And so I think that's where you start to see the split. And you also get it. I mean, we just talked about things that are pretty objective measures, but if you also look at things that are psychological characteristics like emotional intelligence and some of these other social skills, right, that are
Mhm.
needed for a good relationship and to be someone who's marriageable, men, of course, lag behind in these skills as well. So that you hear a separate topic sometimes called the crisis of men. And I don't know if you call it a crisis, but there certainly are problems there,
Right.
and there's some lag. And in heterosexual relationships, then that creates some matching problems.
And do we feel like this is correlated to some of this new stuff, like social media, gaming, stuff like that, like the crisis that they're in? I mean, like I know in the anxious generation, Jonathan Haidt was talking about, this group of men in Japan, and let's see, what are they called? The hikikomori that just withdraw from society. Like they've had, usually it says it's some sort of social or academic failure, and then they just like basically live in their parents' house and play video games all the time and don't ever go out again and don't get a job and just that's all they do.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously not everybody is to that degree, but are we thinking this crisis is kind of being brought on by this technological world? Is it more economy? Is it more, I mean,
Mm.
I know you don't have all the
Yeah,
answers,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess in general, Cynthia, here's how I think about technology and social relationships or social behavior. Um, I think it's technology is just supposed to make things easier or faster, right? If we look at the broadest level possible, you could do the better, faster, cheaper, or you could do it just easier and faster. And that's great for certain things. But when we think about our social lives, I think the question is worth asking is it better for this to be easier and faster? And especially when we're prone to mistakes or personal liabilities, right? With certain things, what if it accelerates or accentuates those liabilities that we have?
Hmm.
So let's do this for the boys, and then we could go to dating. So, for men, I think part of the problem, big picture, has been that so much of their identity has been wrapped up in their career success way before the internet, right? And now, as society is kind of requiring a more well-rounded person, and even some jobs, right, require what they would call the soft skills, um, like getting along with people, right, having
Hmm.
some empathy, these kinds of things that probably should have been important all along,
Right.
I guess. Um, but if you're part of a gender that stereotypically has been more narrow and defined by career success, and now you're in an economy that's unstable and a career environment that's unstable, then yeah, you just have what social psychologists would call a less complex sense of self. And when you have a less complex sense of self and all your eggs are in just a few baskets, when things go wrong, it's more devastating and you have a harder time being resilient under those circumstances. So once again, I think what we want to do is we don't want to get on the individual boys or men too much. They need to take responsibility, obviously, but also we want to say, what are the societal shifts going on that these boys and men are having a hard time with? And can we kind of ease that a little bit or facilitate that transition so they're not struggling so much? I think the
Well,
same thing. Oh, go ahead.
but I was going to say, like, in terms of online dating, then I heard this really fascinating podcast with Scott Galloway. It was on the A Bit of Optimism, and he was saying that online men want a woman who's attractive, but they actually have a much broader view of what is attractive, whereas women seem to have like this more narrow view of like, well, I want somebody who can signal their ability to garner resources in the future. And so, I want the guy that just graduated from MIT and he's got the new job at Google, and he just happened to have his Rolex in his profile picture. And so he was saying what's happening now is like the top 10% of men that are quote unquote attractive and highly educated and everything, they're getting all the attention online. And the bottom half of men are just being completely shut out of online dating. And I'm sort of feeling like, okay, if that's a guy that you maybe would have met at the bowling league or at church or at whatever, you'd get to know him. He's great. He's wonderful. You guys start dating, whatever, but you're going to totally ignore him when you're just swiping through and he's not part of the 10%, which I'm wondering what you're thinking about that. And also, like, I'm so intrigued to find out what you have been working on in terms of like dating apps and AI and that sort of contribution.
Yeah, yeah. I think Galloway's right, certainly about those things. And all someone has to do is take a look at the user interface of these online dating apps, and it becomes, plain and clear what's being emphasized here. So, Tinder, for example, it's going to be the picture. It takes up
Yeah.
the majority of your phone screen. There's going to be a first name, and then there will be an occupation on there. Now, you can swipe up and get more information about this person. That actually is not that informative, but anyways, you could get some more information.
Mhm.
Um, but one of my favorite studies to think about this came from, it was a study of Hinge users, so another online dating platform. And they looked at hundreds of thousands of users. Now, one of the great things as a researcher is that instead of self-report, which could be subject to social desirability, online dating and speed dating studies, we can see what people actually do. So if you ask people on a questionnaire, what do you want in a partner? They'll say what they think is acceptable. So they say,
Mhm.
oh, I want someone with good moral character. I want someone who's going to be a good dad, whatever
Mhm.
it might be. But now, okay, maybe, but let's watch what happens when you can swipe right or swipe left on
Mhm.
somebody. Well, let's watch what happens when you're in a speed dating situation. And in this Hinge study, they found that people spend about 2 seconds on average on each profile before swiping.
Wow.
So, and it's the swipe left, the rule out, I don't want to date this person, that I find kind of dramatic, actually, because that's not like a weak preference. That means you are hard ruling out that you will talk to this person or get to know this person in the future.
Because
As
I've never used it, but I assume there's not a maybe category. It's yes or
no,
no, right?
yeah, you can't be wishy-washy, left or right, and 2 seconds. And so, what can you look at in 2 seconds? Well, you can look at the picture, and you might take a peek at their occupation. And so, the user interface is actually encouraging this behavior. It's also, though, not to blame tech for everything once again, in real life studies, those are the two things people emphasize the most. So men go for looks and then socioeconomic status, 1 and 2. Women, just the flip flop. So, money first, looks second. So we're naturally drawn to these things. There's kind of evolutionary explanations for why that might be the case. So here's this preference that we have in our real lives, in our face-to-face lives. Now you put people on technology, it makes it easier and faster, and the user interface encourages the thing that comes most naturally to us, to look at for looks and money, right?
Mhm.
And now you have this acceleration of kind of a suboptimal way to look for a partner. The one other thing I'll say about the Galloway stuff that's interesting, you mentioned that the top 10% of like hot and wealthy men get the most attention,
Mhm.
and then the bottom half don't get much. That would be different. Now, that would be different at a party, for example. So
Right.
let's say there's a party with 100 people, 50 men, 50 women. It would quickly become apparent, both to men and women, what their chances are, with certain people. So if they saw, for example, let's say you're a woman, you saw 5 women swarmed around some hot, wealthy guy, you automatically make some decisions just based on competition.
Right.
That, maybe I don't want to, you might still, but you might be like, there's too much going on over there.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's what people don't think about with some of the online dating is, once again, if you take a step back and you think about, so what is everyone else doing? And then given that, what should I be doing? Sometimes you get some interesting insights. And I'm not saying that people should settle for something less, just because everyone's going for certain people. But it's worthwhile to think like, if everyone's swiping after 2 seconds, and let's say you're a woman, and most people are going for hotness and for socioeconomic status, are there then undervalued characteristics
Mhm.
that people are overlooking that I could just swoop up in abundance,
Right.
right? And for folks who have seen or read the book Moneyball, that's one of the things that was really popular in sports like 20, 25 years ago. It was a real revelation. And the Oakland A's, this baseball team, said, hey, we're actually evaluating baseball players on superficial characteristics. It actually was not unusual to talk about how hot a baseball player's body was
Wow.
and to talk about the attractiveness of their girlfriend.
Wow.
No exaggeration. And yet they're evaluating, will this person help us win baseball games?
Right.
And so the A's, which were this small market, kind of poor team, said there are really unsexy things that are actually way more important. And so getting a walk was super valuable, you
Yeah.
know? And they had this kind of team of ugly guys who got a lot of walks and did all these things that were not sexy. And they won a lot of baseball games, won much more than they could. And so you can apply that same Moneyball mentality to the dating market, where you say, hey, what are the characteristics that are actually really important to me? If the goal is to have a happy and enduring relationship, and then what are the characteristics that everybody else is valuing and
Right.
maybe and probably overvaluing? And once you take that stance, the world opens up to you as far as how to approach it differently.
Well, and I mean, I was reading in your book, The Science of Happily Ever After, you're saying the 3 traits that we really should look for if we're trying to find happiness long term is emotional stability, kindness, and loyalty. There's no way you could figure that out in 2 seconds on a Tinder swipe. So it, in some ways it's really not surprising at all if you met somebody online and people are saying that they're not as happy in their marriages with
Right.
people that they met online because here, there's just no way. You can even tell, like, I'm thinking at this cocktail party that you're hypothesizing, the super duper hot guy, 5 women walk over to him immediately. A couple of those women are going to suddenly go, oh, this guy is so boring. Or,
Right.
oh, this guy is so full of himself. A couple of women are just going to be like, next, please, no thanks. And then they're going to go over and get chips and stand next to the guy that they didn't really think was that cute. And he's so funny.
Right.
And, I don't comprehend how you could possibly understand these sorts of nuances online. And I know I sound like I'm 100 years old, but I think you're proving that there's some science behind it, that, some things are not meant to be quick and fast and easy. And
That's right.
it's not fast
That's
food, it's marriage.
yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think for folks who are online dating, apps can be really useful. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use them. But what I'm saying is be careful about who you swipe left on. So who you
Okay.
hard rule out, right?
Right.
And I would just be overly inclusive, because you don't know. Now, if someone is so, I guess, unattractive that you cannot possibly, I get, or they're
But
so,
as to your point, in reality, if you really sat there and stared at the picture for 30 seconds instead of 2 seconds, I bet only 10% of the people are just like so ugly that you can't handle them.
yeah, right.
It's not really 90% of the people that you could not handle.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And that 90% just shows how much people maximize on physical attractiveness over other traits, right? And when I see people swipe left, I think to myself, they want someone who could have been, we don't know, right? Who could have been kind, who could have been remarkably emotionally stable, who could have been stable as can be, but you don't know. And so the advice I give, and I think you would find that a lot of behavioral scientists who work at these companies give, is they would say, this is just a means to get face to face with someone in a safe environment.
Okay.
That's all the app is. And I know there can be like some nervousness about meeting face to face, but yeah, just go to a coffee shop, meet face to face, do the cautionary things you want to do, but minimize the time you're spending on the app, one, swiping, and then two, try to minimize the amount of time you're spending chatting back and forth, because that's a road to nowhere for the most part. Just go get the hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, face to face. That'll start to give you some, and then we know from personality studies that in that hour, you will be able to start to glean some sense of emotional stability and kindness and some of these other traits.
Yeah. I'm interested, what have you done in terms of psychometric strategies for online dating apps? What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's super jargony. I should probably change that on my website. But
It
yeah,
sounds really cool, though. It sounds really impressive.
I was probably just having an insecure day. But so psychometric measurement of psychological things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so these online dating companies will sometimes say, hey, we want to match people, for example. But then the engineers are like, oh, what do we match them on?
Okay.
What would be those concepts or those constructs or the traits? And so I can help them say, hey, well, you could measure personality, you could measure values. Here's what we know from research about what the most common personality traits are or values are. And then you can say from psychological research, so what do we know about what actually matters? So let's say with personality matching, does your extroversion match with a romantic partner predict your long-term happiness and stability, for example? And you can do the same thing with values. If your religious values match, does that predict long-term satisfaction, stability? So that's the psychometric stuff I do, and it's kind of cool, right? Because you can get a sense of who this person is roughly, and then try to do something with that data to get them the best people possible to go on dates with potentially. Now, that being said, there's a few caveats. So a lot of dating companies market on matching. In fact, the largest dating company, Match.com, it's in their name.
Mm-hmm.
And there's now been hundreds of studies done with tens of thousands of participants where they've looked at, does matching on personality, for example, predict long-term satisfaction and stability? And the answer is pretty clear, no. So if you mismatch, so if you're extroverted, your partner's introverted, it's a wash for
Okay.
predicting your long-term satisfaction stability. If your kindness mismatches a little bit, not a huge deal. But let's take kindness as an example. Let's say one partner's kind, the other partner is mean, right? They're just
Okay.
flat out mean. What's going to happen is that's not going to average out to kind of kind, right?
Mhm.
What's going to be predictive is the partner with the worst traits.
Okay.
So the mean partner, their meanness will be predictive of less satisfaction and less stability in a relationship. So that's a very different kind of picture than saying, hey, it's all about matching on traits that matters. It's actually not matching. The way people should approach dating, if they can get it from the app, great, but usually face to face, they should approach dating is saying, hey, what are this person's enduring dispositions like personality or values or attitudes? And then citing red flags that pop up as they're learning about these things. A lot of times when you talk to folks after a breakup or a divorce, they will always say, I should have noticed the following red flags.
Okay.
In fact, it's not so much noticed. They say, I should have weighted the red flags that I saw much more heavily than I did.
Okay.
But even the best of us can have this rationalization where we say, oh, but maybe they'll change. Or, oh, maybe it's not that big of a deal.
Hmm.
And it's just not true, unfortunately. So with these personality traits, sometimes you'll see in popular media, hey, you can change your personality. That's not an untrue statement. But let me give folks a way to think about that. So in these studies where they track people across decades, like from the time they're 20 to the time they're 80, they can see how stable their personality was across these many decades. And the stability is remarkable. So if you're mean as a teenager, you will probably be mean as a senior citizen.
Okay.
Conversely, if you were kind as a teenager, it's very likely you'll be kind as a senior citizen and everything in between. So you can think of it positively as if I get a partner who has amazing traits, that will pay back not only yearly, but it'll compound in interest over time, which is really fantastic. And you can transform some of these esoteric statistics to this kind of simple way to think about it. So about 75% of people maintain their same level of personality characteristic. So if someone's kind as a teenager, there's a 75% chance they'll be kind as a senior citizen. They'll change about 25% of the time. So,
Okay.
it's much more likely people will be stable
Okay.
rather than change into something different. And if you're a betting person and you're betting on something huge here, your lifelong partnership, you don't want to make a bad bet there.
Which is actually really, really comforting in some ways. That if you go on 3 dates with someone and they just really seem a certain way, kind of what you see is what you get, pretty
Yeah.
much. I mean, are you saying there's kind of like you have your baseline personality and you're not going to vary from that a whole ton? I mean, obviously we all have bad days and good days, but you kind of are an optimistic person, you are a pessimistic person, you are sarcastic or rude, or you're helpful, or
Yes.
and so like I don't know, was it Maya Angelou or someone that said like when somebody shows you who they are, believe them?
Yes. Yes.
So
That's a great way to think about it. So yeah, and you can pick it up pretty early. Like we said, I would say at day 3, you have some pretty strong hypotheses. One of the things I always advise people to do is if you're interested in maybe continuing, get the partner out with friends. Friends don't have the same biases that we have. If we really like the person, that's one kind of bias.
mhm.
Maybe if we're skeptical about the person, we have this negative override occurring. But if you take 3 friends who are pretty honest and pretty good about reading people, and they give you their honest opinion, and you average those together, odds are that's going to be a pretty accurate read on who the person is. And, one I should say as a caveat, one of the questions I get when I give talks in kind of bigger audiences is someone will raise their hand and they'll say, hey, so I'm not emotionally stable. I'm a neurotic person. it doesn't mean I'm doomed to have a bad relationship. And I think it's a really important question. And I always say, I already feel good about you.
Hmm.
And I feel good about you for these reasons. Number one, you're self-aware, right? Which
Mhm.
not everybody who's neurotic is. Number two, by asking this question, and you had to have some guts to ask it in front of 200 people or whatever, um, you're very aware of how it might affect other people and motivated to think about that. And so I would bet the farm then that you're already taking consistent and discernible steps to manage how that neuroticism affects other people. So when people hear like, oh, traits are stable and traits can be predictive of long-term relationship outcomes, it's probably the case you have a few traits that aren't great. Any of us, even the best of
Mhm.
us, right? And so then the question is, hopefully you don't have all of them. You don't have all the bad, you don't have all the
Right.
bad traits, which would be hard to do. But then the question is like, so for the traits I have that are challenging, am I doing the work I need to do to have self-awareness? And then number two, am I being really honest with myself about how consistently I cope with that in ways that make it good for other people? And so, a lot of marital therapies, that's what they do. They
Hmm.
kind of gently help you identify, hey, here's this thing that you do. You get explosive with your anger. It's part of the
Mhm.
neuroticism. Here's the consequences of that. So now, right, you're getting a self-awareness piece. And then if it's a good therapist, they'll say, let's work on some strategies to make steps on this so that, yes, you're still going to feel that surge of anger sometimes, but let's have immediate self-awareness. And now let's have a different set of responses to that. Doesn't mean you can't be angry and can't communicate that, but let's do that in a much different way.
Hmm. That's cool. Um, Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I like to ask everybody at the end the same sort of question because in the whole kind of thought of screen less, play more, especially in regards to kids. I know one of the things that is really helpful for kids growing up nowadays is to have some responsibility, some independence, because that seems to be kind of going away. That was the big thing that Jonathan Haidt is talking about in The Anxious Generation is like we're overprotecting our kids in the real world and we're underprotecting them online. And so I'm curious if you would be willing to share a memory of either, doesn't necessarily have to be the first time you remember being on your own, but one time as a kid that you remember just completely being free of parental restraints. You got to do something on your own, go biking, go shopping, go whatever it was. And like, do you remember that? How old were you? And like, how did it make you feel?
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, I was a latchkey kid, so I had a lot of freedom
Okay.
to do a lot of different things. But as far as a flashbulb uh, memory, gosh, my parents would probably be arrested today if they let me do
I
this.
think a lot of our parents would be. And
Probably.
and you know, I don't think I don't think most of them did anything wrong. I mean, some people went way overboard and they were a little bit too hands off, but I think most of our parents just kind of gave us some freedom to roam.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And hey, look, we made it, right? Um, I was really little. I don't know. I want to say I was in second grade, something like that. And we were in San Francisco, which was a much bigger town than Longmont, Colorado, where I grew up. And yeah, my Aunt Esther had given me $40 to spend, and my parents just let me loose in San Francisco. Like,
Oh, wow.
yeah, and we had, of course, there's no cell phones or trackers or anything like that. And I didn't know my way around San Francisco.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I went all over the place. I mean, I was in some neighborhoods that probably weren't awesome. And but I just remember walking down the hill to Market Street, and it was a nice day. I had $40 in my pocket, you know, and I could do whatever I wanted to do. Now living in New York City and, loving New York City as an adult, I can kind of see the early seeds of Yeah. Second grade, Ty Tashiro would have loved being unleashed in San Francisco, you
Hmm.
know, and just that feeling of exploration. And for my traits, for my dispositions, being a novelty seeker, it felt amazing to be able to explore this whole other world. If you feel a little bit scared and a little bit anxious about it, uh, but it was great, and I
Were
think
there
like,
constraints, be back at this time or only
yep,
use the subway, or like what were the rules?
yeah, yeah, we're gonna meet back at Nordstrom at like 3 p.m. or
Okay.
something. And so, yeah, I had to ask a couple store owners, how do you get back to Nordstrom? And it was not easy, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I kind of catcher in the rye sort of feeling to it. Uh, but it was great, And look, some of my other friends, I guess, as I look back on it, some of my other family members did not take that same opportunity,
Okay.
and that was maybe even the wiser choice, the better choice given how old we were.
Uh-huh.
But I guess I give that example because it felt really cool in the moment and so liberating. But I think it was just this broader attitude that my parents had and a lot of mentors in my life had, which is they recognized how little I enjoyed constraint, and how much, I was curious about getting out into the world. And so not only allowed me to do things, but actually constructed opportunities for me to make the most of those traits and to try to develop them. So, when I look back on my childhood, it was not an accident that some of these circumstances were set up. And when I speak to parenting groups or speak to parents, I guess it's one of the things I say that's oddly a little bit counterculture now, um, is, hey, I know your kid has dispositions that make you so nervous. you know?
Hmm.
And maybe because they're some of the same dispositions you naturally have. Um, you know, and everyone knows this when they think about rationally, but the reflex there is to try to contain
Hmm.
those dispositions. And they need to learn how to do that, right? To not make dumb decisions or whatever. But I think the other question is just as important. How do we also nurture that disposition so they get the best sides of that?
Hmm.
And knowing that as a parent, it's going to scare the hell out of you.
Right.
Probably to do that. So yeah, I really appreciate that people provided that for me,
Yeah.
and I think it was very instrumental in me, getting where I'm going. And to the theme of your podcast, I think I was lucky that it never had to be about technology.
Right.
It was about getting out into the world for being in a city or athletics or riding around on bikes with my friends. And, I was really lucky in that regard that I had to figure life out at a very young age.
I mean, do you think that helped your awkwardness at all?
Huge. I would be, I would be a shadow of myself if I had been allowed to, be on technology. Because here's why. Once again, I'm not vilifying technology, but I'm just saying unmitigated, or at the average level that's being used right now. It's not going to be great. I mean, we had 1 hour that we could be on the television, or this is how old I am, on the Atari
Okay.
gaming console. You could do it however you want, but you get 1 hour. And the rest of it then meant that I had to be, yes, riding around on bikes with my friends, or, playing some game where we got into an argument. Sometimes there were hurt feelings or someone
Right.
got bullied or whatever else.
You had to
But
learn facial expressions and respond to how
yeah,
people were reacting to you.
the whole deal. And I think for awkward people, like, there were a lot of times I didn't want to go. I had social anxiety about, oh boy, I go to this birthday party or go sleep over at a friend's house. And true to social anxiety, no good reason,
Hmm.
really for being anxious. Um, but I think that, especially now, even for kids who aren't awkward, that's a huge deal. One of the things I hear over and over from young people is how flaky their friends are.
Interesting.
Yeah. And as you talk about it, it's just like, that sounds kind of driven by social anxiety. And so the person bails on you at the last
Okay.
second. So yeah, I think it's not only the interaction itself and being face to face and learning how to navigate personal space or eye contact or whatever else. Um, but it's also just, the things that come before and after. So the social anxiety about going somewhere that we can even feel as adults, or the aftermath of an interaction. You feel some resentment towards a friend.
Hmm.
And how do you now bring that up the next time so it doesn't fester
Yeah.
in a way that's good for the relationship? And one of the things that happens with technology that's easy but not good is that you can just kind of bail on somebody if it's hard
Yeah.
because there's somebody else you can jump to.
Yeah.
And that goes for dating or whatever else. So I love the idea about a young person being in a super uncomfortable social situation
Yeah. Fight
and
your way through
having,
it.
yeah, exactly. I'll relay one last anecdote here, but I went to get some talks at Washington Lee University like 2 years ago. And it's a kind of smaller liberal arts school in Virginia. And so a couple things happened that were pretty interesting that you might find interesting given the topic here.
Hmm.
So number one, as I got onto campus in the morning, every student said hello to me that I walked by.
Okay.
And coming from New York, I was of course defensive. I'm like, well, what do you want? No, but it struck me as odd, right? And it just as friendly and genuine as can be. Good morning. Hey, how you doing? Couldn't possibly know me. Never been on campus before. Uh, After being there for a little bit, after being there for about half a day, I noticed not a single student had been on their phone while they were standing or walking the entire time I had been there.
And this is
And
undergrad.
this is undergrad. And so I'd seen hundreds or thousands of people at that point. And so I asked some of the students about it. I said, so what is going on here? This is really bizarre. When I'm on other campuses, this is definitely not the case. And it was kind of a funny thing where they just had this epistemic uncertainty about why something was the case because they were like a fish in water. They didn't even realize it. And they said, it's just the culture that there's this culture of, and they gave the example of saying hello to people. So the first day you get to school there, they say, hey, so we all say hello to each other, even if
Oh.
we don't know each other. And there were other things like that where there was a culture of, hey, so we all go to, they still had prom kind of, but more laid back. But yeah, everyone kind of goes to this. And they thought that it was the promotion of these healthy social behaviors that then did not give them time to engage in unhealthy technology
Interesting.
behaviors. And I thought to me, that was a real revelation. It's what we would call behavioral activation in psychology. And it's a really simple premise, but it's kind of counterintuitive, which is that we don't need to talk about the problem a lot. What we need to do is make sure that you're doing the things that are positive behaviors that are in line with the values for who you want to be.
Hmm.
And if you're doing those positive behaviors, you will by definition crowd out, right?
Right.
Thoughts of or time for the negative behaviors. So I think in the interest of moderating technology and encouraging positive social behaviors, I think I actually like that approach best.
So they
And
weren't saying this is a phone-free school. We have rules around this. It was the opposite. They just sort of told them the social mores when they got there of like, we do this and we do this. And then they just kind of basically they fell in step because they wanted to be part of the community, right? And then
exactly.
it all just kind of worked to actually be very pro-social.
Exactly. And if you're a freshman and you see that modeled by the juniors or seniors, you don't want to go against that, right? So you'll do the thing. And yeah, it was really an amazing thing. And the students I met there, which were quite a few, they're really pleased with it and they're really pleased with their sense of community. And so you know, it actually changed me in certain ways. Like I fortunately haven't had to struggle too much with technology, but it did make me think very hard on my plane ride back. Like, hey, so what are the social attitudes I want to have across every day and across every situation? And am I living up to those values or attitudes? And it did lead to certain tweaks so that, I'll give you a quick example. I said, hey, look, unless you're sick or you have something you have to be up early for, always say yes to social time.
Okay.
And that was one thing that changed. And that's been a great idea, And there's been other things like that where I just said, hey, as a broad attitude, these will be behaviors that I always do. And so it can just be an approach people take. I've seen that, I've given that advice to some parents over the years since I was there. And it just goes a lot better with like a teenager, for example. Teenagers obviously don't react well to don't do this.
Right.
They'll just do that thing, but more. But they will have more of an open mind about, hey, this is a pro-social or proactive thing we do. And it's a value for this reason. This is the reason why we do it. It's the same thing I talk about with awkward, folks, parents talking to awkward kids. You have to say, hey, here's the social behavior, and we do this because this is how it makes the other person feel.
Because, most kids say that they're very annoyed by how much time their parents spend on their phones.
Oh, yeah.
And, a lot of teens, I think, are like, well, mom was buried in her phone, so I might as well grab my phone too. There's not another option that you see in front of you. Whereas if your parents are pulling out the board games or asking you to take a jog or whatever, like you're saying, you model what you want to see instead of being like, do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And it's stubborn and as teens can be and so forth, or kids younger than that, I guess. If it's a good parent, they really look up to their parent despite their defiance. And if you're modeling, that's such a great point, Cynthia. You're modeling those values. That's really what you're modeling. It's not the behavior, although it is that. You're modeling values. That's what you're doing.
Right.
And they of course pay a ton of attention to that and
Absolutely.
are very receptive to that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ty, so much. I love these insights. This was so fun to talk to you.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you, and appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for listening to Screen Less, Play More, the podcast. A special thanks to Neil Penninger, who composed our theme music. Please join us at screenlessplaymore.com for ideas on how to get your kids outside, away from screens, and enjoying independent play. We also have book reviews, screen-free toy and gift ideas, and so much more.